Very much, Ahmed. Let me also, like Dina, start by thanking CES for putting this event together. I think it's, I hope it becomes a tradition. It's a beautiful tradition. And in particular, heartfelt thanks to Dr. Abla, who is such a smart, kind, and energetic leader. So a pleasure. Maybe I'll just repeat one or two facts before I answer your question. The World Bank just published yesterday, actually, global reports on poverty, prosperity, and the planet, which kind of confirms some of the trends that you've mentioned. There was progress on the SDGs, but the past couple of years I've seen reversal, and even if it's catching up a little bit now, there's a great fear of this decade between 2020 and 2030 being a lost decade. And we see reversal, you mentioned, on poverty, on inequalities is rising. And even on the climate front, the number of people that are exposed to extreme weather shock is actually increasing rather than decreasing. So, and we've all talked about polycrisis. And so that's kind of the environment we're having that discussion. Egypt, unfortunately, is no exception. Egypt made some progress on different elements of the SDGs. But the UN put out a report this year, and Egypt ranks 83rd out of 166 countries. So it's a lot of challenge. And then last point I want to do as a preamble before responding to your question, I can't help reminding ourselves that actually to have a good conversation on this, you need good publicly available data. And I think that's one of the agenda for the country, just to make sure we can have those discussions on the basis of recent updated data topic we've discussed with you quite a few times. So you gave us a top two for the impediments. So I'll focus on two. Number one, it's not exactly as Dina, but there's a lot of connections with entrepreneurship and technology, and also looking at the system. My number one would be on economic growth. A beauty of the SDGs was to take an even broader picture than the MDGs, which is great, and all of these dimensions are important, but to make progress on most of them, underneath you need economic growth. And I'll focus on Egypt. Egypt has been growing past 20 years, 2% per capita, which is a reasonable outcome, but lower middle income countries, so countries similar income as Egypt, have grown twice as fast. Yes. And when you compound that over 2 decades, it's actually a major difference. Egypt should be starting or continuing a structural transformation to have more entrepreneurs, to export more, to be connected to global value chains. When we look at the past 2 decades, actually, we see that the share of tradables went down from 60% to 50%. So that's kind of the opposite of the structural transformation you'd be expecting, which then translates in lower productivity, and perhaps as important for the country, fewer jobs. This country needs to create jobs. The job creation over the past couple of years have been 2.5% per year, while the working age population is growing 3.1. So fewer jobs than actually the growth of the population. Before I move to my second, I don't want to live with a gloomy picture. I actually believe Egypt has a very strong potential. It has a unique location and an amazing workforce, a big market, trade agreements with a lot of places, and a lot of cultural, natural assets. So there's potential, but that potential is not used, and more growth would be necessary to achieve the SDGs. And my second vote is on the inclusion part. Again, very much echoing Dina's point on leaving no one behind. Inclusion growth needs to be broadened, and its benefit needs to be broadened. In fact, the recent crisis or series of shocks that Egypt has seen, we've seen that even the middle class has been severely affected by those shocks. Inflation, we know, always hurts the poor most. Even in cities, you see more vulnerability now than you used to. education poverty remains very high, with a lot of kids at age 10 who cannot read a text. And there are a number also of health indicators, such as on diet and overweight, that are not as strong as they should be. And again, I'll finish that second point with not staying gloomy. Actually, if the minister had joined us, she would probably articulate better than I will. But I think there are a lot of promising programs in Takaful and Karama, which the minister Maya Morsi would have focused on. Takaful and Karama is a very strong program that has the promise to avoid leaving anybody behind. On education as well, actually, somewhat surprisingly, Egypt is one of the very few countries that saw an improvement in its learning outcomes during COVID. Most other countries actually saw deterioration. As I said, it's starting from a weak base, and much more is necessary. But we see some progress. Haya Karima is another promising program, and the expansion on universal health insurance also bodes very well for inclusion. So I'll leave you with those two: growth and inclusion, both with in my view, a pretty strong sense that much more is necessary, but also a hopeful line that actually the potential is there to do better. Good, thanks. So I focused first on growth. So I think on generating growth, the private sector is essential. So I'll focus my first set of institutional response on this. For growth, obviously, the basics is the macroeconomic stability. So something that has been discussed at length here, including yesterday a great panel on Greece. I think, and I see a couple of friends from the private sector in the room. The question of trust, and I was struck also in the panel on Greece yesterday, the focus on credibility is really important. I think some of the measures that we're seeing now, the tax package that was announced, which is very much designed to rebuild trust with the business community. And I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister we heard this morning will flesh out further his plan for developing the industry. That will help give more of a perspective and rebuild trust. I think fundamental, and we all know, again, somebody mentioned yesterday, the reforms are known. It's a matter of focusing and being able to roll them out. We all know a key part here in Egypt is to revise the role of the state and implement the state ownership policy that was laid out 2 years ago. Part of it is to privatize some of the assets, but given the size of the role of the state, part of it is simply to make sure the companies that are managed by the state have a level playing field. And I think that will send a powerful message to the private sector. I really want to emphasize this point about the private sector, because this is where the jobs are creating. I'm sure Dina would say more on the entrepreneurial side. This is where the innovation is going to come from. Dina will respond to your question on R&D, but R&D doesn't need to be within the government budget constraint. R&D is also the innovation that is coming from the private sector. You know Egypt, you see actually a lot of the young entrepreneurs are bringing a lot of innovations. And of course, eventually more private sector is also more taxes and the ability to rebuild the state and indeed focus on the most vulnerable to avoid leaving anyone behind. So that's the first set of policy. I'll do a quick second one. I'll be remiss not to mention institutions. Just a couple of days after the Nobel Prize for Economics was specifically on that topic. I think here in Egypt, so the problem with institutions is that it's very broad. So it can mean a little bit everything to everyone. So I'll focus on 2 points. One, which will be close to ECS heart, the focus on data that I mentioned earlier and on evidence-based policy. It was refreshing to see the new framework of your former ministry, the Ministry of Planning, with 3 pillars. The first one being evidence-based policy. The ministry for a long time has had a lab, an impact evaluation lab. the clarity, having the right data, the right evidence, and having the space to discuss this evidence, I think is really essential. And the second institution that I want to focus on, again, I'll refer back to the Greek experience in the panel yesterday, is the ability for the state to make choices. Most of the choices, any government around the world, they are made through the budgets and the plan. And as was mentioned yesterday, you cannot make choices if your budget is fragmented in many pockets. And so a lot of the recommendations I would have to both to deal with the overall stability, but also to make choices that are giving preferential treatment to the more vulnerable, to Upper Egypt, that are the more vulnerable parts of the country, or to the more vulnerable populations, to be more inclusive. They will come from making better budget decisions, and they will come from having an integrated budget. So I would focus on those two set of reforms: enable the private sector, make sure the state has the right role so that the private sector can generate jobs and innovate and do R&D, and then reform institutions, because this is where you're going to get the ability to actually focus on the most vulnerable. And I have 20 seconds each, that should be fine. So the bank is called a bank, so we're known for finance. I'll just focus on one thing, which echoes what Vikram was saying. For the 70 more vulnerable countries, we have a fund called IDA, which we are replenishing now. That's actually one of the multilateral solutions. It's nowhere near the scale of what's necessary for the SDGs, but that's one of the few that has actually increased over the past couple of years. So I think that's an important source, but it needs support from a lot of partners. We have more than 50 donors, number one. Number two, increasingly we try through our private sector arm, IFC, to de-risk the private sector and help the development of the private sector. And indeed, a bit along the line of where Vikram stopped, not just bringing big companies from the north to the south, but promoting a lot of south-south investments. When you look at the flows, you can see that this is where the potential and the growth is. Third, even though all that is about finance, I think a real value we can bring is more on the knowledge side. So that can take the form, in a country like Vietnam, we help the country develop its vision for 2035, that then became their blueprint to align, as I was saying earlier, to create trust and credibility. So that was it in a smaller environment or smaller sector. Recently in Morocco, which is a bit ahead of Egypt and implementing its own state ownership policy, we've put together for them a framework for the implementation of their SOE reform. Number 4 is an extension of the knowledge part, which is about exchanging knowledge between countries. So a lot of the solutions in Egypt, as was said before, they are co-created and evolve within the country, and that co-creation actually is very helpful for other countries. So we've used Takaful Karma is one of the projects we use in many other countries now to say, if you want to design a good social safety net project, this is what a program that works. Same for the work in Upper Egypt around Haya Karima. The campaign the Egyptian government did to eradicate hepatitis C a couple of years ago is also a great example that can be explained to and shared with others. And the final point that I would mention that the World Bank can bring is to help the world tackle global problems. So during COVID, actually, we were one of the first actors with COVAX and Gavi and also the African Union and CDC to finance the delivery of vaccines beyond the countries that are actually producing the vaccines. I think our first such project in the region was in Lebanon next door, and then came here in Egypt. So that we can facilitate bringing this at scale. And then recently we've launched a project that aims for the whole of Africa. In Africa, you have 600 million people that still don't have access to electricity. So the project is called Project 300, which is in partnership with several, but in particular with the African Development Bank, by 2030 to bring 300 million people access to electricity in Africa. So our reach across many countries with both the finance and the technical experience helps us contribute to those kind of global programs. So finance, private sector, knowledge exchange, and global issues. It looks like this panel should have been called optimistic or pessimistic. So yeah. I'll leave you with a quote from the German writer Goethe, who said, the pessimist condemns himself or herself to be an observer. So I think we need to be brutally realistic about the situation, but we need to be optimistic. I mean, it's a mindset that things can change.